George Soros is here. He has a reputation as one of the world's great investors. He is a billionaire who made $1 billion betting against the British pound. He has a long-standing interest in public policy. He has written 8 books. In a speech this week to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, he said, "I have made rejection of the Bush Doctrine the central project of my life for the next year." His new book, The Bubble of American Supremacy, spells out his arguments against Bush, the Bush administration, the war in Iraq, and offers some proposals for change. I am pleased to have him back at this table. Welcome back. Tell me first of all, the bubble of American supremacy. What is the bubble of American supremacy, and why do you use a term that has frequently been associated with the stock market?
Yes, because I see a certain parallel between a stock market bubble and the pursuit of American supremacy as practiced by the Bush administration. I see a certain discontinuity, dangerous discontinuity, in our role in the world. Now, I have a theory about stock market bubbles. Bubbles don't come out of thin air. They're based on reality. There's a solid foundation, but there is a misinterpretation, a misconception, and then things are carried too far. Initially they are self-reinforcing. The false idea is reinforced by reality. It gathers momentum. Then it becomes too far removed from reality, becomes unsustainable, and you have a collapse. That's what you had.
Now stop there, and let's just use one example to understand how we can take that application and apply it to America today. The most recent bubble was the dot-com
bubble. Yes.
Okay, tell me what was the reality, what was the irreality, and what happened, and what do we look for that explains that, and then take that understanding and apply it to foreign policy.
Right. You take the Internet.
Right.
It was a great innovation with great potential. It was misinterpreted as a potential source of enormous profits.
Yeah.
Now,
and the creation of a new kind of wealth.
Right. And that misinterpretation actually affected the fundamentals. But it wasn't just a stock market phenomenon, but it actually influenced the development of the industry. The use of the Internet was accelerated by the bubble. Yeah. So it was self-reinforcing. Reality actually moved in favor of the bullish bias that was prevailing in the market. It got carried too far, and then you had the collapse.
Because the stock market prices had nothing to do with the reality of earnings.
Well, as I say, they were exaggerating the prospects, but the exaggeration actually reinforced the possibilities that Internet companies had. It actually accelerated a kind of a feedback mechanism between reality and the stock market perception of reality. It's a feedback mechanism that initially was self-reinforcing and then became unsustainable and led to the collapse.
Okay, now apply that to American foreign policy and American supremacy.
Well, the reality is that we are, in fact, the most powerful nation on earth, that we really have a dominant position, that we set the agenda for the world, and the rest of the world has to react to the agenda that we set. The misconception is that we ought to use this dominant position to impose our will on the world. And that is, there is a sort of ideology that international relations are relations of power. And we are powerful, and therefore we should use that power and impose our will. This finds expression in the Bush Doctrine, which basically has 2 pillars. One is that we must maintain our unquestioned military superiority, both globally and in any one region of the world. Second, that we have the right to preemptive action. And if you put the two together, you have two classes of sovereignty.
All right, let me look at the first one then. We'll come back to preemptive action and our ability or the correctness of applying our power. Do you not agree that the United States should have military superiority in most parts of the world, that it is in our national interest to maintain our military superiority?
No, I agree with that.
Okay.
And I also agree that under certain circumstances, you may be obliged to take preemptive action. But when you put the two together,
okay,
you see, that's a very dangerous brew, because it means that not only should you have the power, but you should use that power. You should impose your will on the world. And that is not how we got so powerful. In other words, this is not what made America great. We have not abused our power in the past. We haven't, occasionally we did. I mean, we invaded Grenada, and we have had small infractions. But now, what we are doing, what we have done under the Bush administration, and partly, of course, as a result of the terrorist attack of September 11, that we have gone off the rails. We have gone too far in the direction of imposing our will unilaterally, arbitrarily, and basically indulging in a self-reinforcing, in a self-fulfilling prophecy that international relations are relations of power and not law. Now, if we, the most powerful nation, believe that, then that becomes the reality. And that is a terrible development for the world, because it really sets us back. Obviously, international law is not well developed. We can't rely on it for our security. That's why we need the first pillar, namely maintaining our military. But we must strengthen international law, not destroy it. And this is what the Bush administration has been doing.
And at a minimum, engage in debate and dialogue if we disagree with some aspect or some policy that has to do with international law, whether it's a Kyoto or whether it's an international criminal court.
A lot of problems in the world, including the existence of tyrants like Saddam Hussein, that we need to deal with. But we can't really deal with them unilaterally. We can't be either the policeman of the world or the godfather of the world. We do need to work together with others. We do need to have some standards. We need to have treaties. We need to have rules. One of the great unsolved problems of our global system now is how do you get rid of the likes of Saddam? It's very important to find a solution to that, because most of the misery and poverty in the world is due to bad government. Yeah. So there has to be a way.
Dictatorial governments or bad governments or the absence of democracy. Would you go that far?
That's right. Or failed states.
Right.
And this, you need to, therefore, to cure those problems, you need to find some way of intervening in the internal affairs of countries. But you have the principle of sovereignty, and that agitates against intervention. So in the constructive part of the book, I deal with that problem, how we ought to lead the world in solving that problem.
All right, let's jump to that then, and we'll come back and talk about some of the questions that might be raised about this. Take Saddam, take Iraq.
Yes.
What you believe, central to this argument you make, is that the president used 9/11 as a pretext to launch an invasion of Iraq and overthrow Saddam Hussein.
The evidence is very clear.
Right. That in fact they always intended to do it. Even you got Paul O'Neill's recent book suggesting that they raised questions about it even before 9/11.
He actually fills a gap in my argument, because I show that the intention was there before the election of President Bush, and immediately after September 11, on September 12, Paul Wolfowitz. In between, there was a little bit of a gap, and he actually filled it in.
All right. So my question is, in terms of what might be a constructive way, a future way, other than preemptive action, how is it possible to deal with a Saddam, in your judgment, if you go to the United Nations and suggest that there are all these violations of UN resolutions, and yet the Security Council does not say, if they do not, vote to join you in an action, what ought to be the United States' position if it believes its national security is at risk?
I think that whenever possible, one should go to the United Nations, but it's not always possible because some countries have veto power, and you can't get the necessary votes.
And that's what happened in Kosovo.
And I supported our action in Kosovo very vociferously. There's a big difference between the two cases. But let me come back to the problem, which is the problem of sovereignty. Now, I argue that sovereignty is basically an anachronistic concept, with kings and subjects and so on. But in the French Revolution, the king was overturned and sovereignty passed to the people.
Yes.
So now you have the sovereignty of the people, but you very often have governments, rulers, who abuse the people over whom they have power. Then you have the need for an external intervention and that justification.
So your argument is the sovereignty of the people?
The sovereignty of the people, leading to the role of the international community to protect the people against abusive tyrants. That actually is a doctrine that has already been proposed. Now, you then need a legitimate international forum that would legitimize that action. The United Nations is clearly has that potential, but it can't always be invoked. And so a coalition of democracies or open societies could also give you legitimacy. In the case of Kosovo, NATO, which is basically because it was Europe, NATO is a European alliance, so NATO had enough legitimacy. In the case of Iraq, let's say NATO wouldn't. But if you had a coalition that included a lot of developing democracies, if the Latin American countries favored it, if some Arab countries favored it, some of Iraq's neighbors, you could actually overcome, let's say, a French veto. You would have enough legitimacy to do it.
Okay. But do I hear you correctly saying that an invasion of Iraq would have been okay if it had been launched by NATO? That in that case you might have favored it if NATO had agreed that it would...
I said that NATO, in the case of Iraq, might not have been sufficient.
That's what I thought I heard you say.
So it was not quite sufficient.
Not because the French might have vetoed it or French might have objected to it, but simply because you don't think that an invasion of Iraq by some institution other than the United Nations was appropriate.
I think that Europe, let's say, in relation to Iraq, would not have any more legitimacy than the United States. Yeah. However, Europe, United States, and a number of other countries would have that legitimacy even without the United Nations.
How about the coalition of the Gulf War in 1991?
Yeah, that would have been fine. And I actually, in the book, propose forming a coalition of democracies based on a declaration which already exists, the Warsaw Declaration, which says that it is in the interest of all democracies to foster the development of democracies in other countries. And if you had that coalition, first of all, it could change the way the United Nations works, because the members of the coalition would have a majority, and they could eliminate non-democratic countries from being on the Security Council or heading the Human Rights Commission. So you could actually have some better functioning United Nations.
So you need the United Nations to be reformed, is what you're suggesting, and certainly at the Security Council level.
Yeah, and this is one reform that I think is possible. Anything that involves changing the Charter, infringing on the prerogatives of the countries with veto power cannot possibly pass because it would need their consent, and they would never consent.
Okay. Let me ask you about a couple of examples, make sure if I can understand where you're going. Is Panama going in and overthrowing Noriega and capturing Noriega legitimate, illegitimate?
You know, I don't actually. I think this was a unilateral action on the part of the United States.
I think it was too.
And while there was a justification for action, I'm not sure that it was all.
Grenada would not have been.
I don't think it would. Grenada was not particularly.
Bombing Libya. After their supposed after the nightclub incident in Germany.
Yeah. I think that was legitimate because you were dealing with a terrorist act, and you had an address. You knew that it was Libya that was responsible for it, and therefore you go after a terrorist. You know where he lives. Our going into Afghanistan after September 11 was legitimate.
You supported that?
I supported that.
Now, why was that legitimate?
Because that's where bin Laden lived. So we had an address.
Yeah.
Now, the problem with war on terrorism, as we are currently practicing it, is that we want to produce some results. But terrorists don't usually tell you where they are.
Right.
So you
and they're not a nation state either.
Yeah, and so you use military power, and you hit innocent victims. So there were 3,000 innocent victims in the Twin Towers. There have been more than 3,000 innocent victims of our war on terror. We don't pay attention to that because they are not Americans. But nevertheless,
well, where are they? Tell me who those victims are.
In Afghanistan, in
so
Iraq.
So we attacked Afghanistan looking for bin Laden and overthrew the government there, the Taliban.
We killed some people, but at least.
But you said that was justified.
I think it was because you knew bin Laden was there.
Suppose bin Laden had been in Baghdad and not somewhere in the mountains.
Then it would have been justified.
No problem with that. As long as there was a response to the attack, 9/11 attacks,
yes,
and you knew that bin Laden was responsible to go after Al Qaeda wherever it was, would have been legitimate.
If Saddam Hussein had given refuge or aid to Al Qaeda, we could have gone after him. But there was absolutely no evidence, and in fact, the evidence goes the other way because Saddam was a secular power and Al Qaeda a religious one. The idea.
The Bush administration still believes there was some kind of connection, not that Al Qaeda, that Saddam had anything to do with 9/11, but they still believe there was some connection between Saddam and terrorist elements.
Well, there's no question that Saddam was a bad person and and an oppressive tyrant, and he killed tens or even hundreds of thousands of his own people using poison gas. So I mean, it's a great achievement, and I rejoice to be rid of him, and I'm particularly pleased, the way we got rid of him.
Howard Dean argues he got in trouble a little bit, or came under some fire because he said America is not safer because of the capture of Saddam.
Yes.
Was he right or wrong?
No, I think he's right in saying that America is not safer by our having attacked Iraq.
He was talking about the capture, but I think he meant by the.
I think that's what he meant, right. And that I really do support him, because it was a misdirection for us to go into Iraq. It weakens us, because we thought that we came as liberators, but actually we came as occupiers. We became occupiers when we moved in.
Now let's just stay with that idea, because you make that point in the book that no matter what was in our mind, the end result was that people of Iraq, in most cases, believe we were occupiers.
Even victims of Saddam's regime feel that way.
Well, most of the people there were victims of Saddam's regime in one way or the other. Most of them, except some favored Sunnis.
Yes.
Staying with that idea, central to your argument is that the consequences of our invasion of Iraq have made us less safe and has given rise to an incredible expansion of anti-Americanism.
Yes. The point is very well made by Wes Clark, another candidate, who in his book says that, you know, our military doctrine is to project overwhelming power.
That's what we do well.
That's what we do well, and that's what gives us that dominant position. We are not trained or prepared to act as occupying forces. And getting bogged down in Iraq as occupiers has really weakened us militarily. So even in terms of the Bush administration's own objectives of projecting overwhelming power, we are worse off having got bogged down in Iraq as an occupying force. We can project less threat or power to the neighboring countries.
We're less able to deal with other threats because we're bogged down in Iraq.
Yeah, we will not spend $160 billion and put our troops in danger again to get rid of another Saddam.
All right. Staying with this argument of whether America is better off because of the attack against Iraq, the capture of Saddam Hussein, the fact that people in Iraq no longer have to fear Saddam. Here's part of a conversation with Richard Pearl recently on this program. Roll tape. Democracy. Helping people create a democracy. Have we learned any lessons about that?
Well,
that
it's hard.
It's hard. Much harder than we imagine.
No, I don't think anyone imagined that it would be easy to fashion a democracy. You had to begin by removing the obstacle to democracy, Saddam Hussein.
And then you had to capture him.
And then we had to capture him, and happily we've now done that. And there is a sense among Iraqis, at last, that they don't have to fear his return. And we are now putting to the test the capacity of people who have been dominated by a brutal tyrant to organize themselves along democratic lines. I'm rather optimistic that they will succeed in doing that. It's certainly worth trying, Charlie, because democracies don't make wars. Wars are started by dictators who need wars to keep themselves in power, who need enemies to keep themselves in power. Internal enemies, external enemies.
So the argument Mr. Pearl is making is that, rightly or wrongly, there's no Saddam, and there's an opportunity to create democracies, and that's better, whether we are occupiers or liberators or regardless.
Well, this is what I really passionately disagree with, because I have actually been in the business of trying to foster open societies. Right. So I know something about it.
Well, tell us how you've been in the business of trying to do it.
Well, I've set up a network of foundations to promote open societies, and it's functions now in some 30-odd countries. We moved in to help the transition from the closed societies of the Soviet system to the open societies of democracy. So in countries like Hungary, my native Hungary, in Russia, in Central Asia, I've got foundations which are run by people in the country who believe in the ideas of an open society. And they decide what they need to spend money on and what kind of actions are needed. And I think that the foundations have made some contribution to promotion of a democracy.
Okay, from that experience, why is it that what Pearl said about hoping to create a democracy in Iraq is so bad?
Because it has to be the people themselves who take you there. Let's say when in Croatia people turned against Tudjman, you then got rid of a dictator. Yeah. But in Yugoslavia, when people turned against...
But are you saying to the people of Iraq who are free today, you would have been better off if you lived longer under Saddam until you were prepared to overthrow him yourself and create democracy. It was none of our business to try to overthrow him on your behalf, because you, A, may not have wanted us to do it, but it was none of our business, and it was up to you to do it, and if you couldn't do it, then you had to live under his boot.
I think we were very right to put a lot of pressure on Saddam.
Well, he was under sanctions already, so
sanctions didn't work that well, because actually they strengthened the regime.
They strengthen most dictatorships, don't they?
Because it leads to smuggling, and who can smuggle?
Yeah.
The one who has access to the local authorities. But anyhow, let's talk now about the after September 11,
Right.
when there was a desire to impose to get rid of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and because America was determined, the UN actually functioned extremely well in passing a very strong resolution. And you had the inspectors there, and they found that the missiles exceeded the range by 20 kilometers, and Saddam had started destroying his missiles.
Right. So your argument is that the UN inspection, Hans Blix and his colleagues were doing a pretty good job. All they needed was more time.
And they were actually effective. There was no way in which Saddam could have used his weapons, even if he had them. And I think that had we given it time, and it would have worked. And I think that the people of Iraq would have actually overturned Saddam, because
Do you really?
they were. I believe that. I believe that because.
Why do you believe that? What
I tell you why.
Empirical evidence is there that suggests they would have had that power?
No, I tell you why. You have to ask yourself, why didn't Saddam come clean? And
no one knows the answer to that.
No,
What's your...
Well, the reason was that he couldn't afford not to have these weapons, because he was intimidating his people. People were afraid of him because he had this overwhelming power. But
Right, so you're saying that Saddam had to use the fear that he had nuclear weapons, that was the reason that he was able to intimidate his own people, not countries outside his own borders.
That's right. That's right. And when he released his prisoners from prison, I thought that was also a sign that he was somehow weakening. Although he may have been preparing for exactly the chaos that occurred after the capture of... that would give him more credit that I'm willing to do. At any rate, I think that Saddam ruled by imposing fear. And I think that the gentleman you showed has a tendency, Richard Pearl, has some similarity in wanting to impose fear on the rest of the world.
Now, what is the fear do you think Richard Pearl wants to impose?
That we can come and use preemptive action. That you rule, you dictators, you rule, at our mercy.
Right. He clearly wants that, because they believe, the administration, Pearl makes no bones about that, and part of the argument for preemptive action in some cases is national security. The other argument is that people who harbor terrorists ought to be fearful of the fact that the United States might come. They believe that's a good thing. They believe that terrorists are encouraged because of Somalia and other incidences in America. That's what they believe.
And they have. And I think this is a reasonable position, actually, because you do have to deal with terrorists one way or another, and your ability to deal with them is very useful.
Hence, you make the argument to attack Afghanistan after Al-Qaeda attacked us, because otherwise they would be encouraged to do it again and again and again and again.
That's right. However, in order to deal with terrorism, you have to locate them. And this requires investigation. It requires police work. You can only drop a bomb when you know where the bomb has to be dropped. And in order to do that, you need information. And in order to get information, you will not get it purely by imposing fear. You must also have the people sympathize with you. They must be they mustn't sympathize with the terrorists. And this is where we have gone wrong, because we have created a lot more sympathy.
Okay, but let me stop you there.
Yeah.
Do you believe whatever the attitude of the Iraqi people was, when the United States came to overthrow Saddam and did it in swift fashion,
Yes.
there was no goodwill for America to do that? I'm not talking about what might have happened after occupation.
Yes.
I'm talking about the act, the military act of overthrowing Saddam. That did not engender any goodwill on the part of the Shiites who'd been living under the terror of Saddam?
No, I think under different circumstances it would have. But, you know, we had abandoned the Shias. They
Exactly.
rose up 10 years ago.
So they had no love for us after that.
Well, they had no confidence.
Right, exactly.
And even now, one of the main problems is that people in Iraq don't feel that we are going to stay there and see it through.
Sure.
You know, because very often we come in and then we quit.
Okay, but that's a good point. Do you believe we ought to stay there and see it through? And what does see it through mean for you?
I think we have to make the transition. We have to have a political solution. We have to have elections. And in order to do that, we actually don't have the legitimacy. We
So in
are
other
an
words,
occupying power.
we ought-
So we are caught. We are in a trap in a way, because we come as liberators. We want to act as liberators, but in actual fact, we are seen as occupiers, and the people whom we appoint don't have any legitimacy. The Iraqis look at them as stooges of the American occupying powers. So you need actually now the legitimacy that the United Nations could bring. Now, there's no way that the United Nations can take over the security issue. That has to be.
They say as much.
And you know, that's not a question. But the political solution would require the blessing of the United Nations.
I want to get to one last issue, George. This notion of where do we go from here? What caused, in your judgment, the anti-Americanism, and how deep is it, and what impact does it have on America's role in the world?
I'm afraid it's now very widespread, and I think I would like to have a situation where it is attributed to the policies of this administration, not to America. In other words, my point is the elections, forthcoming elections, is a referendum, not a normal election.
Right.
It's a referendum on the Bush Doctrine. If we endorse the Bush Doctrine, because after all, President Bush wasn't elected with that doctrine. He was elected on the basis of a humble foreign policy.
And not being engaged in nation building as well.
Right. And I think it was a bit of a deception. I argued that in the book. But at any rate, that was not what his platform. If we now re-elect him, then we are endorsing the Bush Doctrine. And then we have to live with the consequences, which is widespread distrust and resentment in the world. And if we reject it, then we can write it off as a temporary aberration. We have had it before. We've, put Japanese Americans into concentration camps, but we have overcome it. It was a temporary thing. And America stands for certain values, values of an open society. And we would then resume our rightful place in the world as a powerful but peace-loving nation. And that is what is the choice. And this is why I'm so engaged in trying to convince people that we have to reject the Bush Doctrine.
This book is called The Bubble of American Supremacy, Correcting the Misuse of American Power, George Soros. I hope you'll come back, because a lot of things that are in this book that I want to talk to you about, including some of the issues about the future that concern you. Thank you for coming. Pleasure to have you here. We'll be right back. Stay with us.